Okay, so as people are settling, let me welcome you. My name is Barbara Altman. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center, which is a research center as part of the University of Oregon in Eugene. I'm very happy to welcome you to this talk, and thank you all for leaving the beautiful sunshine in the river and coming in to listen to a speaker today. Our speaker is Professor Kenneth R. Miller from Brown University. Professor Miller's field of research is cell biology. He defines his scientific interests as the structure, composition, and function of biological membranes. He has been on the faculty at Brown since 1980. Professor Miller is the author of more than 50 scientific articles, and he has co-authored 5 high school and college biology texts, which are in wide use across the country. In fact, I bet a lot of us, well, some of us might have studied with those textbooks, and certainly our children have, I think. He has also published 2 very well-received books exploring the relationship between religious faith and evolution. The first, Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution, was first published in 1999 and has been reissued multiple times since then. The second book, from 2008, is entitled Only a Theory: Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. It explores the controversy surrounding the teaching of intelligent design. Both of those books are available thanks to Powell's, who are set up in the lobby, and Professor Miller will be signing books at the end of the talk if you'd like to pick one up. Professor Miller is here today to deliver the Oregon Humanities Center Kritikos Lecture for 2008-2009. The Kritikos Professorship in the Humanities was established in 1993 with a generous gift from 2 Portland residents. Its purpose is to bring to the University of Oregon and to the state of Oregon distinguished scholars, critics, and leaders in the humanities in order to promote, and I quote, intellectual honesty and freedom and recognition of the worth of open and honest civic discussion and critical analysis of differing viewpoints and values, unquote. Last night, Professor Miller gave a talk at the University of Oregon in Eugene entitled Time to Abandon Darwin, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, and we had a very lively discussion at the end of that one. We're very happy to bring him up here to talk to our Portland audience this evening. Kritikos professors are known for speaking their minds, even when what they have to say is controversial. Professor Miller is therefore a most fitting choice for this year's lectureship. An athlete, an umpire, a New Jersey boy, he enjoys a good skirmish. I've learned during his visit that he wasn't always a spokesperson for the reconciliation of faith and science on the question of evolution. As a young assistant professor at Brown, he came to it when his students asked if he would debate a creationist, and he's been on that path ever since. Now he speaks on the topic of Darwinism with great eloquence in many settings, from the courtroom and the lecture hall to the Colbert Report, on which 2 times now, he has easily held his own with that acerbic and very funny host. I invite you to look it up on YouTube if you haven't seen them yet. I want to acknowledge the other members of the Oregon Humanities Center for all the work that goes into producing this kind of an event, including the design of the striking posters and all of the travel and hospitality arrangements. Much appreciation, therefore, to Julia Hayden, Melissa Gustafson, Peg Gearhart, and to our stalwart helpers and allies, including first and foremost Chris at the back of the room. And now, without any further ado, let me get back to our wonderful speaker for the evening. As you will see from his talk, Professor Miller is a very gifted teacher. In fact, he holds a special named chair as an outstanding teacher, as well as an outstanding scientist. His books have met with great critical acclaim because they bridge science, the humanities, and religion in a unique contribution to, and perhaps a resolution of, the hotly contested evolution wars. Please join me in welcoming Kenneth R. Miller.
Thanks very much. Well, Barbara, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming. It's a great honor to be named as the Kritikos Lecturer for this year, and I especially appreciate the time I've spent in Eugene and the time I have been spending today in the Portland area. One never knows how one is going to be introduced, so I always like to bring my own introductory slides so I can tell you who I really am. So I apologize for doing that. I am indeed a cell biologist. I work on biological membrane structure and function, and my main research tool is the electron microscope. And you might wonder, how does somebody like that get involved in evolution? Well, the answer actually turns out to be very simple, and that is in a moment of weakness, you allow a former student to talk you into doing something absolutely crazy, which is sitting down with him to write a general biology textbook. That former student was named Joseph Levine, and Joe, longer ago than I care to count, persuaded me that this would be worthwhile, and the result has been a whole series of college and most notably high school textbooks that are used around the country. Now, we don't have that many college students in the audience here tonight, but when I was on the campus at Eugene yesterday, as soon as I flipped that slide around, there was a massive groan from the students in the audience, because I thought, oh my God, that's that 1,000-page book I had to carry around in my backpack for years. Now, writing those books has been a very interesting experience for me. I've been blessed with two daughters. The oldest one, Lauren, is a wildlife biologist who works for the Audubon Society. Lauren, thankfully, was able to graduate from Dighton-Rehoboth Regional High School in Massachusetts, where we live, before Dighton-Rehoboth High School chose that book for its students. Tracy, my younger daughter, was not so lucky. So she had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's textbook for biology her freshman year in high school. You might wonder, did it have an effect on her? The answer is probably. She became a history teacher. So never quite sure what to make of that. And the town in which we live, Rehoboth, Massachusetts, is very small. It's only about 8,000 people. And for quite a few years, people in that town knew me, but not because of what I did for a living. The reason was, during that time, I was sort of like the commissioner of the girls' softball program. So I would run the spaghetti suppers to earn money. I trained our umpires. In the summer, I coached one of our all-star teams. So everybody kind of knew me as a softball guy, but they didn't know what I did for a living until the high school adopted that book with the elephant on the cover. My picture was inside my name. All of a sudden, my cover was blown. And you might think that's a good thing. Well, in some respects, it was. But about a month into that school year, I'm driving up to the high school to pick Tracy up after field hockey practice. And standing in front of the high school is a woman I know through softball, another coach, Bonnie Kelly. And Bonnie flags me down, so I drive over in front of her. And she yells at me as I'm pulling up, Ken, you wrote the book that they use in the high school now. And I got, that big dumb look on my face that you get when you think someone is about to compliment you. And I puffed my chest out and I said, yes, Bonnie, I did. And then she looked me straight in the eye and she said, funny thing is you don't seem that smart. So never quite sure how to take that. My wife suggested consider it a compliment and move on, which I think was pretty good advice. Barbara was kind enough to mention two books that I've written for popular audiences, the first of which is called Finding Darwin's God. I have been speaking out on this issue for quite a few years, and person after person had told me you ought to write a book about this, and finally I sat down and I did. And when I wrote this, I thought this would be a little book, and what I mean by little is I figure, Mom and Dad will get a copy, they'll be very proud of their son. My brother will buy a copy. My department chairman will be amused to see that on the CV of a cell biologist, and that'll be pretty much it. To my absolute astonishment, that book is now about to go into its 29th printing in paperback. And what that tells me more than anything else is how hungry people are in this country to see someone address the very issues I tried to tackle in that book. Now, it's been about 10 years since I wrote that, and a lot has happened in those 10 years. And earlier, actually last year, I published a new book called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, which actually came out in paperback this week. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is in that book. And if you find the talk interesting and you want some backup reading, that might be a good place to look for it. Now, as I was driving down here today, as I was being driven down here today, I was trying to think, what's the proper way to set the stage for what I want to talk about? And I think the proper way to do it actually is political. I'm sorry, I was going to say we're writing another book. Don't worry about that. That was just a cheap advertisement. We've just lived through what I think is the most interesting political year, certainly in my memory. And my memory these days goes back quite a few years. And I enjoyed literally every single moment of the presidential campaigns in 2008, both parties beginning to end. I think it was really colorful. It was interesting. It was democracy at its very best. And in particular, I remember one of the major party debates, I won't tell you which one, in which all the candidates were lined up, and the moderator decided to have some fun. So he asked them a provocative question. And that was the question. Is there anybody on the stage who doesn't believe in evolution? And if you were watching that debate, you might remember that 3 hands went up. And those hands were held by Sam Brownback, Mike Huckabee, and Tom Tancredo. Now, to be fair, the next day, Ron Paul said that he'd been confused by the question, and if he'd understood it, he would have put his hand up too. So it turns out there were actually 4. And all of these gentlemen subsequently explained why they said this. But to me, the most interesting explanation, especially as a biologist, came from former Governor Mike Huckabee of Arkansas. And I found it interesting in part because he was one of my favorite candidates this year. And I don't mean that in the political sense. I mean that in the sense of personalities. Because Governor Huckabee, I think, has a great sense of humor. He had a distinguished record as governor of Arkansas. I really mean that. He's very candid. You know where he stands on every issue. And he also plays an absolutely wicked electric guitar. And I would really like to see that in the White House. So I thought that was a big plus. But when he explained why he said this, his response almost literally sort of burned its way into my memory. And here's what he said. He said, if anybody else wants to believe that they are the descendants of a primate, they are certainly welcome to do so. But he, of course, did not. Now, the reason I thought about that is because I actually hoped, after he said that I could run across Governor Huckabee during the primary season when he was campaigning in Massachusetts, where I live, or in New Hampshire, where they all hang out, which was right nearby. And I never managed to do it. But if I had, I would have gone up to Governor Huckabee and would have told him how much I appreciate his candor, his candidacy, and his sense of humor. And then I would have called him over real close. I said, I don't want any reporters to hear this. Governor Huckabee, just between me and you, I got to tell you something. Governor Huckabee, you are a primate. and not only that, so were your mom and dad. So you are descended from a primate no matter what. And he might very well say, you know, I could imagine him saying, really, who says? You know, because if it's what that Charles Darwin guy says, I'm not buying anything of his. And I would say, no, Governor, it wasn't Charles Darwin. The guy who decided that humans were primates did this work 150 years before the publication of The Origin of Species. The person who did this was Carolus Linnaeus, the father of modern biological classification. And Linnaeus was a creationist. And he was such a creationist that in the frontispiece of his book, which was written in Latin, he wrote, Deus creavit Linnaeus disposuit. And if you still speak Latin, and those of you who are laughing either can speak it or are pretending that you know what that says, it says, God has created, but Linnaeus has arranged. And that's what he saw his job, is arranging things. And here's a nice picture of Linnaeus, sharp-looking guy, nice wig, whole business. And in case you doubt that Linnaeus, in fact, classified humans as primates, it turns out the rare book collection at my university has got a copy of his famous book on classification. And I went there and I scanned a page and took a couple photographs, and here it is. This is what the book looks like. And here you can see order Primates, primates, and the very first genus mentioned is, in fact, Homo. That's us. So it really was, and if you run into Governor Huckabee, be sure to remind him that he is, in fact, a primate, regardless of what he thinks about evolution. Now, I think Governor Huckabee's remarks are indicative of something that we all know. And that something that we all know is that evolution is an issue that divides Americans. Time magazine a couple years ago pointed this out in a cover story entitled The Evolution Wars. They pointed out that in some polls, most Americans actually seem to reject the theory of evolution. They pointed out when they published this that our president at the time, President Bush, had taken a position on teaching evolution, not a particularly helpful one from my point of view. But look very closely. My co-author pointed this out to me. Look whose textbook they superimposed President Bush's face on. That's actually our book. And we like that because, you know, we're always looking for new cover art for our book. And in a couple years, the state of Texas may be buying textbooks, and this just might be a winner. So we'll have to see how that works out. But to illustrate the level of this controversy, in just a 12-month period, I actually ended up in federal court testifying in trials on the teaching of evolution in 2 states, in Georgia and Pennsylvania. I'll talk about the Pennsylvania trial at some length in a few minutes. About a year later, evolution was the issue in statewide elections in 2 other states, and those were Kansas and Ohio. Now, if you wonder, what does an election that turns on the issue of evolution actually look like and sound like, I figured I'd help you out. I brought the front page of the largest newspaper in Ohio here about 10 days before the election, and here was one of the articles right on the front page, normally low-profile contest in Spotlight. This was the contest for the State Board of Education in Ohio, and they focused on one seat in particular. That seat was held by the leader of the anti-evolution forces on the board, a University of Akron professor named Deborah Owens-Fink, and her pro-evolution opponent, with the very memorable name of Tom Sawyer, is the other guy that you see right there. Now, what did discourse sound like this in this campaign? A talk show host in Cleveland put it this way. He said, if you believe in God, creation, and true science, vote for Debbie. If you believe in evolution, abortion, and sin, vote for her opponent. And, you know, with discourse like that, you might wonder, how did the election turn out? Well, it turns out, in retrospect, that I guess you might say the sin vote was much more powerful than anyone had expected, because pro-evolution school board candidates literally swept the elections in Ohio. And in Kansas, pro-science candidates also took over the control of the Kansas Board of Education, a hold which they solidified in the 2008 elections this past year. And the reason for this is largely because scientists, educators, health professionals, and all sorts of people who were simply interested in quality science education got together. Scientists climbed down from the ivory tower and they made the case for science education to the voters. And I'm convinced that the American people, given the information and the choice in any state in this country, will choose science every time. And these elections have given me hope that, in fact, that is indeed the case. But this is still a contentious issue. If you color in the states, in the last few years where an anti-evolution measure has passed at least one house of the state legislature, we color in about 6 more states. And if we then go to the local Board of Education level, it turns out literally every state, almost every state in the United States, has seen significant anti-evolution activity at the local board level. So it is not a mistake to say that this is a nationwide problem. It's not confined to the Deep South or flyover country or any particular region. This really is a national issue. Now, it hit, the national issue hit home in a small town in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago. This town is called Dover, Pennsylvania. It's about 15,000 people. And what happened in 2004 is that the Dover Board of Education voted to instruct their biology teachers to prepare an intelligent design curriculum in biology. This is, you can't make this stuff up. This is actually what the scoreboard looked outside Dover High the next day. It said intelligent design 1, Darwin nothing. And one of my friends emailed me that, saw it on the internet and emailed it to me and said, isn't that depressing? And I said, no, I don't think that's depressing at all, because an old baseball player, one of the things that I realize is it doesn't hurt to let the other team get a couple runs ahead as long as you're going to get to bat in the bottom of the 9th. And I told the guy, look, they made us the home team. And that means that we're going to, in fact, get to bat in the bottom of the 9th, which is exactly what we did. Now, as it turns out, the biology teachers, at the risk of losing their jobs, refused to teach this curriculum. They said, actually, this stuff isn't science. You should fire us if we do teach it. So what happened, and think about this, the school board then decided to write their own lesson on intelligent design. They then asked the teachers to read it to the students. Once again, the teachers refused. So they sent the assistant superintendent and the superintendent into the biology classrooms on one day to read the lesson to the students while the teachers literally stood outside in the hallway. The next morning, 11 parents, outraged by this, marched down to federal court in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and they filed this lawsuit. The lawsuit is known legally as Kenneth Miller versus Dover, after the first named plaintiff, this unassuming woman up here in the blue blouse, Tammy Kitzmiller. Now, what was going on here? I mean, the Dover Board of Education one day have coffee in the morning and say, let's rewrite the biology curriculum? Well, the answer is no. They were actually being influenced by a group based not very far from here, the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. Members of the Discovery Institute have co-authored this booklet, Intelligent Design in Public School Science Curricula, a legal guidebook, and it's basically a playbook that tells you how to put this supposedly legally into your classroom. And it recommends things like the purchase of an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People. Much more about that in just a little bit. So what was happening in Dover was a school board finally saying, yes, we want to do what you guys up in Seattle have suggested, and we're going to give it a shot in this particular small town. Now, I've used this phrase intelligent design a couple of times, and I think it's a good idea to define it. And I want to start out by saying what it doesn't mean, because this is a very clever term in terms of its choice. I would say that theists, broadly speaking, people who believe in a God of any sort, I think by definition believe in what you might call a transcendent intelligence. And they might actually express that as a view, that there is something you might call an intelligent design or an intellect to the universe. For what it's worth, that's a point of view I happen to hold myself. But that is not what is meant by intelligent design in this context. What actually is meant by intelligent design is the view that what they call design, and what they mean by that is outside intelligent intervention, is required to account for the origins of living things. And what this means is intelligent design is completely different from this sort of general philosophical consideration of meaning and purpose and value. It is in fact a doctrine of special creation. Now, why do I say it's special creation? Here's the reason why, and it's really very simple. When one says that the animals of the Cambrian period were designed, or when one says that the bacterial flagellum, this beautiful little molecular machine, were designed, you don't just mean they were designed. You mean that design was actually executed. In other words, the genes to specify those pathways, those organisms, those animals were actually created by some sort of a process. They were each created in a special act, and therefore intelligent design really is a theory of special creation. That doesn't mean it's wrong. That just means calling it by its proper name. Now, for intelligent design proponents, this was, in their eyes, a great opportunity. And the reason was that they wanted to present the science of design in as hospitable an environment as possible. Federal court cases, the judges are picked by the luck of the draw. They managed to pick a judge that they were very happy to get. His name was John E. Jones III. He's a lifelong Republican. He was recommended for the federal bench by Senator Rick Santorum in Pennsylvania, at the time one of the most conservative members of the Senate, and he was appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush, who said he is a strict constructionist on matters of the Constitution, and indeed he is. And what they fantasized about was getting Darwinists under oath and breaking them down under cross-examination to admit, I guess, that evolution was just a lie. And what you see here in the NBC TV courtroom sketch is a representative Darwinist, that's me, on the stand being cross-examined by attorneys representing the school board. What actually happened, and you'll know this if you follow the trial, was entirely different. And what the trial demonstrated as much as anything else was the complete collapse of intelligent design as anything even resembling a scientific theory. Now, how did all this happen? Scientifically, it involved showing that what I would call the icons of intelligent design were simply wrong. These are arguments, examples that are used to say that evolution couldn't have produced this, that, or the other thing. And the favorite icons are things like the bacterial flagellum, this cool little ion-powered rotary motor, the complicated proteins that clot our blood, and even complex systems like the immune system. Supposedly, none of these could have evolved. My job, and I was the lead witness for the plaintiffs in the trial, was to explain that these objections, in fact, are incorrect, and there are very good ways to explain how these complex systems indeed did evolve or might have evolved. And obviously, I was effective in doing that. No credit to me, because I was largely talking about the consensus position of the scientific community, which is very strong on these points. But tonight I want to show you what I regard as the really critical element in the trial. And the critical element is the way that the trial exposed intelligent design as not a scientific theory, but a religious idea masquerading as science. Now, one of the ways in which we did this was by taking a very close look at that intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People. If you open this book, I have to tell you it sounds very scientific. You don't see anything in there about Genesis or gospel or Jesus or anything like that. It is written to sound scientific. Here, for example, is the definition of intelligent design. Intelligent design means various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency with their distinctive features already intact, fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings, and so forth. Sounds very scientific. Our attorneys decided to subpoena the publishers of this book to ask them, has this book ever been published before? Is there an earlier edition? Has it ever been published under a different name? Could you give us editorial correspondence, page proof, stuff like that? I saw no point to all this. The lawyers got 7,000 pages of material from the publisher. They started to go through it, and when they saw what was there, one of the attorneys called me up and told me about it. I was laughing so hard I could hardly stand up. All I could think of was, didn't these guys learn anything from the Nixon administration? You can't leave this stuff around. You got to burn it. Now, let me show you what they should have burned. It turns out this book had been published earlier under a different name. That's why we didn't know about it. That different name was Biology and Origins. But the interesting thing about it is Biology and Origin reads paragraph for paragraph, just like Pandas and People, with one not so subtle change. Look at this paragraph. Creation means Various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent creator with their distinctive features. It's the same paragraph. And all these guys did was to fire up Microsoft Word, do a global find and replace, find the word creator and replace it with the word designer. This started life as a book on creationism, which the Supreme Court has already labeled as inherently religious. They decided they wanted to cover it up. Now, am I picking an isolated example? No, I'm not. Watch this. Barbara Forrest, who was one of the heroes of the trial, a professor at Southeastern Louisiana University, went through all the earlier versions. She counted the number of times they mentioned creation. That's in red, about 100 times in the book. The number of the times they mentioned design. It's always less than 15, and sometimes it's close to 0. And as you can see, the early versions, it's all about creation, nothing about design. Watch this. All of a sudden, bang, at a particular time, creation drops to 0. That's the find and replace. And up goes design to take its place. So clearly something really remarkable must have happened in 1987. Now you might wonder what happened in 1987. Well, earlier this year, I was speaking at North Carolina State University, and I was joking with a bunch of really wise guy fraternity kids in the front row, and they were telling me how smart they were and everything. And I said, oh, I'm really impressed in the whole business. So I got to this point in that lecture, and I used this slide, and I said, okay, you guys are so bright. What happened in 1987? And one of them very excitedly starting to wave his hands. And I figured, he must know. So I said, okay, sir, what happened in 1987? And he jumped up and he said, I was born. And you know, all I can say is, you know, sir, I'm sure it was a really remarkable event. But I don't think it's what we're talking about here. Here's what happened in 1987. This is a timeline of court cases on the theory of evolution. This is the Scopes trial over here, way on the left. This is Selman versus Cobb County. That's the Georgia trial that I was talking about earlier. 1987 was a case that got to the Supreme Court. It's called Edwards versus Aguillard. And in this case, the Supreme Court definitively labeled creation science as religion and therefore unsuitable for the science classroom in the public schools. That's when they made the change. So you can imagine them. They have this wonderful new book. They want to put it in the classroom, sell it to public schools. All of a sudden, the Supreme Court says, you can't put creationism in the science classroom. They gather around. Anybody got an idea? What should we call this? A brainstorm term. Somebody comes up with the idea intelligent design. They think about it. It sounds great. Get the book. Get us Microsoft Word. Change the name of the creator to the word designer, and we'll pretend that we're not religious. This was an extraordinary thing, and you could see the judge's expression change as we brought this material forward, because here was a deliberate attempt to conceal the content and the intent of this book, and he saw right through it. So it was really a striking event. Now, those of you who followed the trial might know that public broadcasting was watching as well, and they produced a remarkable show called Judgment Day. It's a 2-hour show. It appeared on Nova about 2 years ago, and it was broadcast again earlier this year. Those of you who did not see, for those of you who did not see it, I thought I would bring a little teaser to show you what this television show is all about, because it really captured the essence of this trial. Here it goes.
On Nova.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
There's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turned, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial, on Nova.
I hope the narration was dramatic enough for you. We called that, there were several narrations we listened to. We called it the end of the world narration. This was an extraordinary piece of documentary filmmaking. It won the Peabody Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. You can get this for about $15 from Amazon on a DVD, or if you're cheap like me, you can also watch it free on streaming video from the Nova website. And I really recommend viewing it, because this is an extraordinary documentary that shows everything that was at stake scientifically and so forth in this trial. Now, all of us who are involved in this trial had interesting offers and questions and opportunities afterwards. A lot of us were asked to give interviews to radio and television stations and so forth, and I was too. One of the most interesting of those interviews occurred on, for me, Comedy Central. And I actually ended up on the Colbert Report about a month and a half after the trial was over, exchanging witticisms about this with Stephen Colbert. And Stephen and I had such a good time that when my new book came out this past year, he called me up and said, now I have an excuse to have you back on the show. And I made a second appearance on the Colbert Report this year. I resisted the temptation to show that clip, but if any of you want to hang around afterwards, I can show one of these clips to you and you can go ahead and watch it. For those of you who are involved in higher education or just interested in it, I have a very depressing message with respect to this, and that is, after I was on this show, my students reacted. And the way in which they reacted to me as an educator was kind of depressing. And the reason for that is nothing I have ever done in my entire scientific and professional career has ever earned for me the respect with my students of being on the Colbert Report. That has to be a misplaced sense of value somewhere, and I think that's exactly what it means. Now, I haven't told you how the trial turned out. The trial lasted for 7 weeks. The judge took the case under advisement early in November, and just before Christmas in 2005, he announced his decision. The decision was a sweeping one. It was that when intelligent design simply is not science and doesn't belong in the science classroom. This was widely reported in newspapers around the country. It was reported on television. It set off all sorts of celebrations among the plaintiffs, our legal team, and so forth. So it was an extraordinary victory. And what I would like to pretend is that what happened in this trial really exposed intelligent design for what it was, and therefore we don't have to worry about this anymore. But the reality is that's not the case. And in this book, I basically argue that this battle is not finished. It's the result not just of a problem with evolution, but of a continuing attack against scientific rationality itself. That's really what's at issue, and I think it matters for our country's future. And I mean that in several respects. Now, interestingly, after the trial, there were some very frank admissions by people who were really the advocates of intelligent design. This gentleman is Philip Johnson, a retired professor of law from the University of California at Berkeley. And Phil Johnson is universally acknowledged as the person who is behind the intelligent design strategy. He wrote the key books, he got the people together, he developed the strategy. But look at what he admitted in an interview afterwards. He admitted that the scientific people had let him down. He says, I don't really think there is a theory of intelligent design at the present time that we can propose as a comparable alternative to the Darwinian theory. Now, he doesn't believe in evolution. He just says, we don't have an intelligent design theory that's comparable. And a little bit later on, he admits, no product is ready for competition in the educational world. So when someone asks you, why shouldn't we teach intelligent design as well as evolution in our schools, remind them that Philip Johnson, the originator of that idea, has admitted, we got nothing to teach. We don't have a theory of intelligent design that is ready for the classroom. And that was a very frank admission. And intelligent design, by every respect, is a scientific failure. But if it's a scientific failure, it is a big-time public relations success story. Consider this. This is one of those charts you're not supposed to be able to read, so don't worry about it. But what you see here are surveys of more than 30 industrialized countries, about 1,000 citizens in each one, asking people, do you accept the theory of evolution or not? And if you said yes, you're in blue. If you said no, you're in red. And if you weren't sure, you're in that color in between. Now, I'm not sure if you can pick out the United States on that chart because the print's kind of small, but I'm going to help you. We're right there. The only country we finished ahead of was Turkey. Now, it turns out that in my graduate program, Molecular and Cellular Biology at Brown, we actually have a couple of Turkish grad students. These are great kids who went to the best university in Turkey. They're doing great research. And as this issue of science came out, I looked out the door of my lab and saw one of these guys walking down the hallway. And I had taught him before, so I knew who he was. So I said, come on in here, look at this. And I showed him this graph, this issue of Science magazine. And he looked at it, he read the article, he shook his head, he put his face in his hands. And I said, what's the matter? And he goes, I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed. We couldn't even beat the United States. And I think that's a perspective to worry about. Now, how does all of this happen? And I have to tell you, I think there are two principal weapons in the hands of the anti-evolution movement in the United States. Weapon number one, quite frankly, is intentional distortion. And I'll use Pandas and People, that ID textbook, as an example. One of the arguments that you hear all the time by people who object to evolution is that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution requires that the fossil record be filled up with transitional forms, intermediate species, that show how one form of life changed into another, and they're just not there. There aren't any transitional forms. Now, Pandas makes that argument in a very sophisticated way. They present students with drawings, and these are good drawings, of fossil organisms from the Devonian period, about 350 million years ago. And they say essentially that evolutionists are so stupid that they actually believe that lobe-finned fish, like this Eusthenopteron, changed into early amphibians, tetrapods, like this Ichthyostega. And in this diagram, they say, look, do you really think that bones like this in a bony fin could magically overnight simply change into that with no intermediate forms? And here's what they tell students. And remember, this book is intended for 14-year-olds. They ask them how many different transitional species were required to bridge the gap between these two. We don't know. But we do know that no such transitional species have ever been recovered. There's nothing in there. Now, what they're saying in a graphic sense looks like this. On the transition from fish to land vertebrates, all that the evolutionists have is a lobe-finned fish like Eusthenopteron and an early amphibian like Ichthyostega, and there's nothing in between them. No transitional species have ever been recovered. Even when this book was published, that wasn't true. If you had gone to a vertebrate paleontology book, you would have found a diagram like this. So what these guys had done was to omit two perfectly good transitional forms, Acanthostega and Panderichthys, in between them to imply that the fossil record has a much larger gap than it did, and also to overlook the fact that this is actually part of a very well understood evolutionary transition. But tonight I want to go a little bit further, and that is I want to see, can we find another transitional form at this exact point where we go from water to land? And specifically, can we find a transitional form between Panderichthys, a lobe-finned fish with a bone structure so robust that it clearly could have lifted itself out of the water, much as mud skippers do today, and Acanthostega, a very early amphibian, but the most fish-like amphibian that has ever existed. It has internal gills, which no adult amphibian has today. It has a fish-like head, and it has a fish-like tail. It's a very fishy amphibian. But can we get right in between here? So I'm going to show you a clip of a scientist who led an expedition to find just such a fossil, and you'll see what he found.
In 1999, paleontologist Neil Shubin and his colleagues set out to find just such a creature.
What evolution enables us to do is to make specific predictions about what we should find in the fossil record. The prediction in this case is clear-cut. That is, if we go to rocks of the right age and the rocks of the right type, we should find transitions between two great forms of life, between fish and amphibian.
Armed with this prediction, Shubin and his colleagues organized an expedition to one of the most desolate places on Earth, the Canadian Arctic, about 500 miles from the North Pole, where rocks of just the right age are exposed.
Money was running out. This was it. We were told this was our last year up there. And then in 2004, in the third day of the season, a colleague of mine was removing rock and discovered a little snout sticking out the side of the cliff, just exactly like this. And he removed more rock, and more rock, and more rock, and it became clear this was a snout of a flat-headed animal. And that's when we knew, flat-headed animal at 375 million years old, this is going to be something interesting.
They called it Tiktaalik, which means large freshwater fish in the language of the local Inuit people. And it's one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered, showing how land animals evolved from primitive fish.
Over here you have a fish of about 380 million years old. And what you see, just like any good fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You compare that to an amphibian, you find a creature that doesn't have scales, and it's modified the fins to become limbs, arms and legs. And the head's very different. It has a flat head with eyes on top and a neck. What we see when we look at the fossil record, at rocks of just the right age, is a creature like Tiktaalik. Just like a fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You can see the fin webbing here. Yeah, when you look at the head, you see something very different. You see a very amphibian-like thing with a flat head with eyes on top. It gets even better when we take the fin apart. When we look inside the fin, as in this cast here, well, you'll see it as bones that compare to our shoulder, elbow, even parts of wrist, bone for bone. So you have a fish at just the right time in the history of life that has characteristics of amphibians and primitive fish.
So what you have is a transitional form that is so good that it almost looks like you drew it up on a drafting board. And specifically what has happened, and this has happened since the trial, besides Tiktaalik, in 2006, another intermediate was found in the same evolutionary transition. This is more on the fishy side. It's called Goganathus, and it has a fin with bones corresponding to our humerus, radius, ulna, and the bones of a primitive wrist. It's a fin waiting to evolve into a leg and a wrist. So the way in which you could look at it is we already had a pretty good understanding of this transition. Tiktaalik plugs itself right in there. Goganathus plugs itself right in there. We have so many intermediate forms that we have an embarrassment of riches, and we understand exactly how this critical transition in the evolution of vertebrates on land took place. Now, I have a former student and a real wise guy who teaches at Swarthmore College. His name is Colin Parrington, and Colin has a way with a phrase. And Colin told me once, Ken, if you're ever in a debate with these guys, don't show a lot of slides, don't talk about DNA sequences, which he knows I like to do. End it all with one sentence. And this is the sentence Colin suggested: we have the fossils, we win. End of story. And I think that's a very good way to put it. Now, these are fossils, of course, of primitive amphibians. Many of us are interested in fossils of another species like ourselves. And it turns out that the human fossil record is much richer than most members of the public actually think. Here we have a very famous, nearly complete skull called ER 1471. That's usually classified as a species named Homo habilis, very similar to us, but different in a number of ways. And about 8 or 9 years ago, another species called Kenyanthropus platyops was discovered. And in the issue of Nature that reported Kenyanthropus platyops, the editors decided they put together a little summary of all the pre-human fossil species that had been discovered at that time. Many people like to say that there's some sort of missing link between us and our primate ancestors. The answer is no, there's not a missing link. We have so many links in here that we're not sure who the direct great-grandfather was, who's the cousin, who's the crazy uncle up in the closet, or anything else. But we have all of these links. We don't always know how to connect the dots, but we have plenty of specimens. Now, the interesting thing to me is when this issue of Nature came out, I opened the issue and I looked at this diagram, and I knew I had seen it before. It looks so familiar to me. But how could it? This is literally hot off the press. It's the latest issue of a journal. I couldn't have seen it before, but I had this sense of deja vu that it looks so familiar that it had to be somewhere. And it took me 3 or 4 days to figure it out. I woke up one morning and I thought, I know where I saw it before. Charles Darwin put only one illustration in the book On the Origin of Species. And it was an illustration that showed how species would evolve if you had a complete fossil record. Here it is. Charles Darwin's back-of-the-envelope sketch in 1859 looks uncannily like our current understanding of the human fossil record. The old guy got it right, and he got it right the first time. It's really startling how closely Darwin's prediction of evolution matches what we now know about our own species. Now, to drive this point home, a friend of mine, Nick Matsky, who worked for the National Center for Science Education in Oakland, California, and now is in grad school at Cal Berkeley, hit upon a sort of a dull, systematic paper and said, here is the way you make the point about human evolution. You can see it has the uncatchy title of Variation in Hominid Brain Side, How Much is due to Method. I'd like to recommend read this paper. If you read this paper and you had trouble with sleeping, this paper would put you to sleep, because it has 35 pages that look like this. Nothing but table after table after table. But Nick realized that there was something valuable in here. What these authors had done is to take every single pre-human skull that has been discovered in the last 5 million years of fossil history and calculate its cranial size. What Nick did was to take that data and type it into an Excel spreadsheet and plot it. And when you do that, here's what you get. And you can see the names of the species up here. Every dot is an individual specimen. That's how many specimens we have. And what you see is a smooth and continuous increase in brain size, starting from about 400 cubic centimeters and going up to 13 or 1400 cubic centimeters. Is there a gap in there between humans and non-human primates? I don't see one. What I see is a continuous pattern of evolution. This is how strong the fossil record actually is. Now, I show this in particular because, to my recollection, the single most overhyped fossil discovery of all time has just hit upon us this week. And this is the discovery of an early primate skeleton. This is not a link, no matter what the discoverer said. This is not a direct link to the human species. This shows how the whole branch of primates to which we are related, gorillas, chimpanzees, baboons, even baboons, are in fact originated about 45 million years ago. It's an extraordinary skeleton, there's no question about that. And we're going to learn a great deal from this, but this is not the missing link. The missing link has already been found, and it's been found in the evidence that I've showed you before. Now, I'm not a paleontologist. I can't look at a skeleton and make intelligent conclusions about it, but I do work in cellular and molecular biology. 2 weeks before the Dover trial started, Nature published the DNA sequence of the chimpanzee genome. I read those articles and I called up our attorneys and I said, gentlemen, this is a gift from God. We have to change my opening testimony. And I meant that in every respect. And I'll show you why. The lead article said, more than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that we humans have recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction. And indeed they had. But the problem was a lot of this stuff was really technical. And if I had gotten on the stand and testified about the percentage of conservation of synteny between two species, the judge would have fallen asleep. So we had, and I don't mean any offense to anyone in the audience, so I apologize in advance for this. We had to put this in terms that were so simple that even an attorney could understand them. So that's what we did. And these are the actual slides that I showed in court. And here's the way we figured we'd explain this to the judge. We've known for a long time that we share recent common ancestors with the other great apes, gorillas, orangs, chimpanzees, and so forth. But there's something very peculiar about this. We humans carry 46 chromosomes. All the other great apes, without exception, have 48. Now, all of you in the room who are trained in biology know those 46 chromosomes come in two sets. You got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. A baby chimp gets 24 from mom and 24 from dad. So we are literally missing a pair of chromosomes that all of our great ape primate cousins have. How's that possible? Is it possible that in the lineage leading to us, a pair of chromosomes just got trashed? They didn't get taken along in cell division. Well, you can talk to any primate geneticist, and the answer is no, it's not possible. The loss of, there's so many important genes on every primate chromosome that the loss of both members of a homologous pair would be fatal. You wouldn't even be able to get through embryonic development. There is, in fact, only one possible explanation that's consistent with evolution, and that is the two chromosomes that are still separate in the other primates got accidentally stuck together in the line leading to us to form a single fused chromosome. That would have dropped us from 24 pairs down to 23. So that's the explanation that's consistent with evolution. In fact, it's the only explanation that's consistent with evolution. But here's why evolution is science and not just conjecture. It's a testable explanation. It predicts that somewhere in our genome we carry a recently fused chromosome. If we can't find that fused chromosome, then the whole idea of human common ancestry is in trouble. But if we can find it, it's a powerful confirmation that this prediction, in fact, was true. Now, you might wonder, how do you identify a fused chromosome? Well, here's how you do it. It's remarkably easy. I've sketched up here a couple little diagrams of two chromosomes. Near the tips on either end of every human chromosome is a very special and easily recognizable region of DNA known as the telomere. Telomere DNA is highly repetitious. You can pick it out at a glance. Near the center of every chromosome is an equally recognizable region called the centromere. If one of our chromosomes today had been formed by the fusion of two primate chromosomes, you know what it would look like? It would have telomere DNA in the middle where it doesn't belong, and unlike every other chromosome we carry, it should have two centromeres. So all we have to do is look around. If we don't have such a chromosome, Darwinian evolution is in trouble. Well, what's the answer? You might already suspect it. We do carry that chromosome. It's called human chromosome number 2. And human chromosome number 2 has every single marker I have just told you about. It's got telomere DNA in the center. It has 2 centromeres. They correspond. Their DNA sequences correspond to primate chromosomes 12 and 13. Everything is there. Is there any way that you can explain these facts? And DNA sequences are facts. They aren't theory. They aren't hypothesis. These are facts. Are there any way you can explain these facts in light of the hypothesis that our species was uniquely created or specially designed? Well, the answer is no, you can't. Evolution is the only way to explain these facts. About the only thing you could do is to say, well, maybe one day the designer wanted to fool us into thinking we had evolved, and he rigged chromosome number 2 to play a little joke on us. And the only thing I can say is if that was his intent, he did a heck of a job, because the marks of evolution are all over the human genome. So this is very powerful stuff. The second weapon is what I would call fear of evolution itself. And I want to bring up my friend Rick Santorum, the very senator who recommended Judge Jones for the case. As it turns out, Rick Santorum has been a critic of evolution for a long time. He wrote a book a few years ago called It Takes a Family. And in the middle of the book, there's a detailed criticism of why evolution should not be taught in our schools, or why it should be taught with something like intelligent design. And I am a compulsive NPR listener. Can't help it. Sorry about that. And I'm listening one day, and I hear Senator Santorum being interviewed. And the interviewer asks him, why are you taking a pot shot at evolution? And Santorum says it, meaning evolution, says it has huge consequences for society. I mean, it's where we come from. Does man have a purpose? Is there a purpose to our lives? Or are we just, you know, the result of chance? And he thought for a minute, and he said, if we're the result of chance, if we're simply a mistake of nature, that puts a different moral demand on us. And then he thought a little more, and he said, in fact, it doesn't put a different moral demand on us than if, in fact, we are a creation of a being that has moral demands. Now, the syntax is a little confused, but he's speaking ex-temp, so I'll cut him some slack on that. So what he's saying, basically, if Charles Darwin is right, then the whole idea of morality is an illusion. In other words, the very idea of right and wrong. And that's a powerful statement. And I speak to college students, and I mention the word morality. I can always see them sort of pull back, because they think morality means I'm going to tell them, don't do sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But morality is a whole lot more than that. Morality is, what is the just society? How should we treat the poor? Under what circumstances is war justified? These are all moral questions. And I want our politicians thinking about these moral questions, and you probably do too. So when Santorum says it doesn't put any moral demands on us, that's a powerful statement. And I want to focus in on that, because this is a commonly held view, that evolution is a doctrine to be feared, not so much because it's right or wrong, but because of its human consequences. The largest anti-evolution organization in this country is called Answers in Genesis. A couple years ago, when there were some killings at an American school, they put this web page. And you look at the web page, and you have the gun pointing right at you. And who was to blame for these killings in the schools? Charles Darwin. What they said is, as a society, we reap the consequences of the unquestioned acceptance in the belief in evolution every day. It diminishes your worth and reduces human beings from being made in the image of God to being mere players in the game of survival of the fittest. Kids are killing each other because biology teachers are telling them that they evolved. That's the fearful doctrine. So I want to address that directly. Is evolution really driven by mistakes, meaning we are mistakes of nature? Well, an awful lot of my fellow biologists would say, yeah, it is. And the reason they'd say that is because the raw material for evolution, genetic variation, is produced by mutations, changes in DNA that are heritable. And we always think of those as being mistakes. But I want to go through something that my undergraduate biochemistry professor, Frank Rothman, forced us to think about way back in the 60s when I was an undergrad. He said, you think mutations are mistakes? I want you to imagine an organism that replicates its DNA perfectly every time. It never makes a mistake. You might think not making mistakes is a good thing. Well, if you don't make mistakes, it means you have no mutations. If you have no mutations, you have no possibility for change. If there's no possibility for change, then there is no evolutionary process. And do you know what would happen to an organism that was incapable of evolving to changing environmental circumstances? it wouldn't survive. So maybe these mistakes are not the wrong thing, but rather the right thing. Maybe evolution isn't a mistake of nature, maybe it's a feature of nature, and maybe we could say it's an essential element of the design of nature. Now, the reason I put it this way is very simple. Here's the reality. Life is material. We live in a material world. This is, by the way, one of the few things that Madonna got right. Life is material, and the capacity for life is simply built into the physics and chemistry of matter. Because of that, evolution, I would argue, is not a mistake. It's an inherent and a predictable property of nature. And what evolutionary processes do is they explore what biologists call adaptive space. And in doing that, they are driven by non-random natural selection and natural law. People often say evolution is just random change. It's not random at all because natural selection is not a random force. Now, what does all of this mean? I would say that the true design of life is the evolutionary process and the world of matter and energy that makes that life possible. That's what I would argue is the architecture of life. So an evolutionary design to life, I think, is really part of the inherent fabric of the natural world. So here's the lesson, and I think this is an important one. Evolution is an emergent property of our universe. It comes right out of the conditions of matter. If you are a person of faith, if you're religious, it then becomes very easy to see evolution as a natural mechanism that comes right out of the natural world and simply reflects the will of the creator of that natural world. And I think this is the way in which a religious person can understand evolution. And I'd go further. I would say that this is how a religious person can understand science as well. To a religious person, the source of the order and the design in nature that science investigates is the ultimate source of everything in nature, and that is God. Now, if you're not a religious person, that order is still there. And you might say it has some other source, maybe multiple universes or just happenstance, but the order is still there anyway. And to me, the ultimate point to be made is the study of that nature, which is what science is actually the same. And this ultimately is why science is compatible with faith, and that is because science can be done by people who do or do not possess religious belief, because in either case the focus is on the reality of the material world. Now, I would argue, and sometimes when I talk about this to religious audiences, they tell me, yeah, but I don't like the materialism that is encompassed in science. And what I would argue is a material science, and science has to be materialistic, it doesn't have to be hostile to religious faith, and I also don't think religious faith has to be hostile to science. To my religious friends who say they're worried about scientific materialism, I remind them of something that C.S. Lewis once wrote in Mere Christianity, and that is, God likes matter, he invented it. And that, to me, is the ultimate explanation for scientific materialism. If you're not a person of faith, and you think I've gotten all mystical here, I would cite a well-known atheist, Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan, that we humans are a way for the matter of the cosmos to come to know itself. And I find that to be a deep and profound statement, even coming from a person who would not have identified himself as religious. Now, am I going out on a limb by arguing that evolution is compatible with religion? Well, in the eyes of some people, I probably am. But I want to point out this guy. This is Teodosius Dobzhansky, probably the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century. There actually is a Dobzhansky Prize given every year by the Society for the Study of Evolution. His contributions were legion. Biologists often remember him because of a single sentence he wrote at the head of a very influential article. The article was published in 1973, and there's the message. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. It's an extraordinary statement, and it's absolutely true. But in the very same article, Dobzhansky said the following: the diversity of life to him is reasonable and understandable if the Creator made the living world not by caprice, I would say not by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. And then he went on and said, it is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. Why? Because to him, he says, evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4004 BC. It is a process that began about 10 billion years ago and is still going on today. And I don't think anyone has ever put it better than this. Now, to illustrate how broadly this view is shared among religious people, I want to show you a paragraph that was emailed me by a geneticist friend of mine at Brown. And he sent this and he said, Ken, I want you to guess who wrote this. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I think you can see most of it. And I'll skim through it. Big Bang, 15 billion years ago. Stars and planets, 10 billion years ago. Solar system, 4.5 billion years ago. Scientists aren't sure how the first life happened. General agreement, first organism dwelled on this planet 3.5 billion years ago. Since it's been demonstrated that all organisms on Earth are genetically related, it is virtually certain that all living organisms have descended from this first organism. That's as good a one-paragraph summary of the natural history of the universe as I've ever seen. You want to know who wrote that? This guy did. He wrote it when he was called Cardinal Ratzinger. He's now called Pope Benedict XVI. This is actually part of a report, and to be fair, he didn't write it. He chaired the commission that put the report together, the International Theological Commission, Communion and Stewardship. And in another paragraph in the same report, he and his committee wrote, they knew what was going on in the United States. And they wrote, there's a debate, and these people have it wrong about the nature of divine causality. He said, many neo-Darwinian scientists, people who say that evolution says there is no God by this, and some of their critics, intelligent design people, think that if evolution's a radically contingent materialistic process driven by natural selection and random genetic change, there's no place in it for divine causality. But he says, wait a minute. According to our understanding of divine causality, true contingency, unpredictability, in the created order is not incompatible with a purposeful divine providence. Apparently, nobody had ever told the Holy Father not to use a double negative. My high school English teacher would have winced at that. But nonetheless, he says, even the outcome of a truly contingent natural process can nonetheless fall within God's providential plan for creation. Now, since he's been Pope, Benedict has underlined this point, and he's actually called the conflict between creation and evolution an absurdity. And to a group of journalists a couple years ago, he said, this contrast is an absurdity because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality that we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being. Now, if that's a little too complicated for you, don't worry about it. Pick up the New York Post. They make everything simple. Evolution and God do mix, Pope. And I think that puts it all together very nicely. Now, you might wonder, what am I saying at this point? Am I saying that the Bible should be read as a scientific textbook? Is that what Pope Benedict or somebody else? Yes, of course not. I don't mean that at all. But I also want to let you know I'm not the first person to say that. And I want to call to your attention something written by St. Augustine at the beginning of the 5th century. Augustine was one of the earliest and the most prolific of all the Christian writers. And I like to quote Augustine because he's generally accepted by people in all of the Christian traditions, Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic, and so forth. And he wrote a book called On the Literal Meaning of Genesis. And you can read this for yourself. The type is big. But I'm going to translate this into what I think it means in 21st century English. Even a non-believer can study geology, astronomy, zoology, botany, and other scientific fields, and can gain scientific knowledge from observation and experiment. Now, the worst thing that could happen would be for a non-believer to hear a Christian, presumably explaining the Bible, talking nonsense on these scientific topics. We Christians have to do everything we can to prevent the embarrassment of non-believers showing up scientific ignorance in a Christian and laughing it to scorn. Look at what Augustine is saying. Don't pretend that the Bible can answer questions about science, because if you say it can and you're wrong, the non-believer will basically laugh at you and will ignore the important message of Scripture, which is the message of salvation. Now, usually when I talk to scientific audiences, they really like me right up to the point where I start to quote from Augustine or read a psalm, and then they get kind of suspicious. And then I was asked, actually, a couple years ago by a scientist, what kind of science would we get if we followed the precepts of some weird 5th century mystic like Augustine? And that is actually a representation of Augustine. And when he asked me that, I thought, I have a very good answer for you. And what I want to do is I want to answer you with a personal example. This is an individual who was so influenced by the thought of Augustine that he joined a religious order founded according to the precepts of St. Augustine. He became a priest in that order. He was very highly regarded by his fellow clergymen, so much so that they made him the abbot, the head guy of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brunn in what is now the Czech Republic. Now, at one point in his life, this very religious man got interested in what today we would call a scientific question. He was interested in how plants pass characteristics along from one generation to another. So how did he answer that question? Did he read Scripture? The answer is, of course he did. He had to do it every day for the Roman office. Did he pray? He had to lead the monastery in prayer every day. It was one of his duties. But to answer the scientific question, he went into the garden and he did experiments. The name of that Augustinian priest was Father Gregor Mendel, the founder of the modern science of genetics. What kind of science do you get? If you follow Augustinian precepts, the answer is you get darn good science, you get genetics. And I think that's as profound a statement as anyone can make about the ultimate compatibility of science and faith. I think one of the people who put it best at the end of the Dover trial that I've talked to you about was Charles Krauthammer, the very conservative columnist for the Washington Post. I seldom agree with Krauthammer politically, but I often agree with him on matters like this. And at the end of the Dover trial, look at the title of the column he wrote, Phony Theory, False Conflict. He called intelligent design phony. Intelligent design foolishly pits evolution against faith. And he's a columnist because he can turn a phrase. Here's how he put it. How ridiculous it is to make evolution the enemy of God. What could be more simple, more brilliant, more economical, indeed more divine, than a planet with millions of life forms, distinct yet interactive, all ultimately derived from accumulated variations in a single double-stranded molecule, pliable and fecund enough to give us mollusks and mice, Newton and Einstein, even if it also gave us the Kansas Board of Education. And I think that puts it very well. Now, I'm often asked by people whether or not I find evolution depressing. And I always shoot back, what do you mean? And they said, well, don't you find it depressing to think you came from an animal, that you're just an animal, that you're the result of a mistake of nature? And the answer is, no, I don't think so. I find it sort of uplifting to think that I'm part of the same fabric of life that has conquered this planet, that covers it, that clothes it in such beauty and such diversity. But I never had the right way to say it. And I said it best, was also the person who kept this page in a notebook. It's a notebook from 1839. And it's very rare in the history of science you can point to one piece of paper and say right there on that notebook page is one of the great discoveries in the history of science. And what this guy did one afternoon that year was to make a kind of sketch that nobody had ever done before. At the top of the page he wrote, I think. Then down here in his really bad handwriting he wrote what he thought this would mean. A couple weeks later he realized his description was inadequate and he went back and he added a few notes here. It took him 20 years to get up the guts to publish what he found. And when he did, at the end of this famous book that you've all heard of, he decided he'd summarize his feelings about evolution. He didn't find it depressing or demeaning in any way. He said, no, quite the contrary. He wrote, I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And ladies and gentlemen, I think those are words to live by. Thank you very much. I think Barbara will be kind enough to pass the microphone around.
Yes, there is a microphone on the side, but I'm also happy to bring you the mic. And sir, you certainly had your hand up first.
Yes, sir.
It was a real pleasure, sir.
Oh, thank you.
I saw you on
thank you for coming.
And, you know, it is interesting how people have a dislike for science. Our first 6 presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams were a deist, and Abraham Lincoln. So there is a tradition of science in the United States, the Enlightenment.
Yeah, and I was also, Ed, just because in driving up here today I saw these Lewis and Clark markers.
Right.
I remembered that Lewis and Clark were sent on their expedition, a federally funded science expedition by President Thomas Jefferson, who was himself a very accomplished amateur scientist.
Right, but I have a problem here. when I was in college, I became influenced by Heraclitus, change in the universe, in life, everything. So I am heathen in some ways because I do believe in change. But I read Darwin's Black Box, which was
by Lehigh University biochemistry professor Michael Behe.
And I found a disturbing thing. They don't have a model. They genetics of Mendel. Well, Mendel didn't have modern genetics, but the fossil record and genetics. I mean, dinosaurs in northern China having feathers, and supposedly there's not links. But what I have a problem here is people say this is going to be and that's going to be. I do feel that evolution is an open book, sort of like Leakey once said when they said, what is the direction of evolution? He put a question mark. And I think that like that recent discovery you made, or not made, but mentioned.
I wish I'd made it.
Right. One person, I saw the paper, the newspaper article saying an ancestor of man. You emphasized. But what do you feel the result will be? Will this be a struggle for years and years and years, or will people like me, I call myself an agnostic deist, but you said you're a theist, so I'm kind of somewhere like you. So I could, what's going to happen?
Well, I'm not that good at predicting the future, and if I was, frankly, I wouldn't be lecturing in Portland today. I'd be lecturing in Vegas because I could make some money off predicting the future. But I do think evolution has always been controversial in the United States. A colleague of mine, a historian at the University of Wisconsin, Ron Numbers, has actually made a scholarly study of the reception in the United States that evolution was given, beginning in the 1880s and going up to the present time. It's always been a controversial idea. My concern is not that there will always be a group of Americans who say, evolution is bunk. And given this wonderful characteristic that we Americans have of disrespect for authority, they'll feel free to thumb their noses in the faces of scholars from U of O or Berkeley or Stanford or Harvard or anywhere else. That's not the issue. The issue really is whether or not this will continue to be a country that in its popular culture embraces science, that encourages its young people to go into science. What I worry about this movement is that it will basically tell a whole generation of young people that science is not to be trusted, that you have to turn your back on your values to enter science, that scientists lie and cheat and misrepresent data. And if we turn a whole generation of young people off from science, we're going to lose world scientific leadership. And if we do it, we'll never get it back. So that's what I worry about. And I think in America right now, I think we're at a tipping point. I think we could go either way. And I see very hopeful signs in the elections that I talked about and changes in the popular culture and maybe even changes at the top in Washington, that the attitude towards science is going to the proper side of that tipping point. I can't predict it, but I'm sure hopeful that that's what's happening. So thanks for your question.
There you go. Thanks. I have about a half dozen quibbles, but I'll pass it by. One thing, just in terms of the integrity of this dialogue, I really wish you would distinguish between evolution and the Darwinian process. There's a lot of people who have no problem at all with 3.8 billion years of the history of life on the planet who think Darwin is garbage. And there's also, I think there's a danger in this. I think that your characterization of intelligent design, you see intelligent design, but basically the guys up in Dover just hijacked intelligent design. The guys in Seattle hijacked the idea of intelligent design. Intelligent design goes back to Plato, it goes to the Stoics, goes up through Hegel and Kant, American pragmatists. I mean, the idea that this is a discredited, non-scientific theory is just crap, and I wish you would quit saying that. And you need to distinguish people who just stole the idea and then say, because they stole the idea and they're a bunch of idiots, therefore the theory's wrong. It's like,
well, with all due respect to your quibble, I did. And you'll remember that early on...
distinguish here very well.
Well, I think I did, because early on I said, intelligent design could be understood to mean this general value of meaning and purpose and order.
I picked that up.
But in the current American context, this is the hijacking. Okay. That is not how the term is used. And the term is used to highlight a specific...
You're letting them use it, though. I mean, the thing is the idea that nobody else is talking about intelligent design in a scientific way is just incorrect.
Okay.
Okay. Eric Snyder, Into the Cool. I showed you that book. I mean, this is, You're trying to throw out the legitimate critics of Darwin with these creationists.
I heard your question. Give me a chance to completely answer it. And you will note that toward the end of my talk, I used the word design repeatedly, talking about the design of life, the design, and so forth and so on. And I've actually given several talks at the AAAS meetings, and I'm going to give another one at the Cold Spring Harbor Conference this Saturday on evolution, arguing that we in the scientific community should reclaim the term design, because intelligent design is a perfectly respectable intellectual term. It simply is not, in the current law text, when someone says, let's teach intelligent design in schools, or let's have an intelligent design textbook, inevitably what is meant is this particular form of special creation.
But you're picking out those people, and what I wish you would
I'm picking out those people because they are the ones.
I agree with all that.
Because they are the ones in the public discourse.
You have an obligation as a scientist to talk credibly about this and make that distinction that you just made.
Good, and
that is that intelligent design is a perfectly legitimate scientific, hypothesis, and it's got tons of evidence and so forth about it. You may not like it, but whatever. Anyway, the last thing I'd like to say real quick is I think you don't appreciate, why do 67% or 62 or 48% of the people, are they just stupid?
No.
Okay, here's what I would say. And one thing I would say, real quick, there's a couple of things about why, because I think the objection is a moral objection. I don't think it's an evidential objection at all. I think it's a gut level. Maybe they're not scientists, so they don't say. The moral objection really comes down to Malthus. And it comes in the Malthusian thing, connects up with the selectionists, okay? And the guys that I was showing you, the emergentist guys, are very non-selectionist. There's very good, credible stuff out there. It's a very non-selectionist theory of this. And the selectionist thing leads to this idea that, well, like, reality is it's all against all, Dawkins crap, about the selfish gene. It's a reductio ad absurdum, and then you embrace it. And that's what people are, people have a moral compass, and they have a moral intuition. And the moral intuition is the Darwinian account, the Darwinian interpretation of this evidence is just wrong. And that's why they're objecting. They don't know how to object scientifically, but gut level, they're going like, I know where my moral compass is. I have a moral intuition. And the idea that life is just the all against all. I was talking, there's the guys at Enron were, they were talking at Harvard about this stuff. And they were saying that, hey, it's all against all, morality is it. And that's stuck in there with Darwin. And it's not really Darwin's, it's the Malthusian assumption of scarcity.
Now, again, give me a chance to respond, okay? Who is the most famous, he passed away recently, but who is the most famous evolutionary biologist in the United States in the last 20 years? Stephen Jay Gould, exactly. Who was the most outspoken anti-selectionist in the whole field of evolutionary theory? Stephen Jay Gould. So you can hardly argue credibly, that the evolutionary establishment buys the absolute selectionist because the leading evolutionist in the United States was the leading critic of evolution. No, please, you gave a long talk.
Distinguish between evolution and selection.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. And I am not an absolute selectionist. The other thing that you would realize if you'd read a lot of my articles and seen the criticisms of them is I am often accused of being in favor of intelligent design. And the reason for that is because what I argue is ultimately there is a kind of intelligence to nature. I've been profoundly critical of Richard Dawkins. Chapter 5 of Finding Darwin's God is basically an attack on Dawkins. The chapter that I wrote in my new book called The World That Knew We Were Coming is basically an attack on Dawkins, Hitchens, and his ilk. Earlier this year in print at the Templeton Foundation website, I went back and forth and I debated Christopher Hitchens on the issue of whether science makes the whole idea of a divine intelligence obsolete or not. Obviously, I thought that it didn't. So I honestly think that you're overstating the way in which evolution... Okay, but I think other people want to answer questions, and you've constantly jumped up and stopped me from answering yours. But the last thing I want to say is very simple, and that is that if you ask any person what intelligent design is, they will tell you it's the Discovery Institute program to teach this kind of special... you can say no, 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 no. Please, you're doing it again. Please let me finish answering so I can get to somebody else. The reality is this is what it means in the popular imagination. I defined it carefully, and then I went about trying to refute it. Yeah.
Hi, Ken. I appreciate your ministry, if that's what you want to call it. I'm a fellow Christian. One thing I wanted to ask you, this is something I'm struggling with. I'm trying to see if you can give me some insight on this. the question ultimately is, can evolution be God-guided? And just to give you a little bit of my own thoughts, on the one hand, it seems like the answer is no, because scientifically, you can't put God in there. God can't guide things, because then you'd have a miracle, and that's not science. On the other hand, if you look at the complexity of the eye and the brain and all that kind of stuff, you kind of say, with common sense, there's no way this could happen. I don't care how many billions of years you have, there's no way this is going to structure. I work at Intel in computer chip design, and I know how much sweat and work we put into there, and this is nothing compared to the human body. So, you know, I'm perplexed there.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
No, but evolution is brainless, and we have our brains are a lot more smarter than nature.
Well, a couple, just a couple of quick responses to that. Now, I don't know if you're using these tools right now at Intel, but an awful lot of computer chip designers and software designers have started to use what they call genetic algorithms to get the best chip design or develop the best program. Genetic algorithms are based on evolutionary natural selection, where you set up a selection criteria for how suitable a programming language or a particular design is, test it, iterate it, make some changes, and allow it to work in an evolutionary
That would never
setting.
work for a microprocessor. They are so radical.
Yeah,
there's no way they would even evolve.
No.
Even the new generations are totally different, new architectures. There's no way to do that by trial and error.
Fair enough, but it is a fact that the term genetic algorithm does exist, and it is used in information technology from time to time. Now, the notion of a divine guidance of evolution is something that I reject as a scientist, but I also reject it as a Christian. I don't think it's necessary. I don't see any reason, theologically, why the architect of the universe has to violate his own laws to achieve his own ends. And it seems to me that what you have in the evolutionary process, and this is something I tried to make explicit in my new book, is this algorithm that searches adaptive space, as I said in one of my slides. And what I argued, essentially, is that as it searches adaptive space, it took about 4.5 billion years on this planet for evolution to get to the complex, reflective, self-aware intelligence that we carry around in our own brains. What would happen if evolution had run a different course? I would argue that eventually that process was bound to get there. And complexity in evolution comes about not by some random mechanism, but it comes about through the stringent conditions of natural selection that are constantly testing these designs. And the fact of the matter is that vision has really evolved over and over again in the animal kingdom, following the same set of genetic switches, they're known as the PAX6 genes, that basically build visual systems one after another. And I don't really think that these complex systems are an indication of outside guiding. I think they're an indication of the genius of the process itself and the architecture of matter, energy, and the process of natural selection that makes it all possible.
So the complexity of the brain and the eye doesn't give you any trouble at all with, I mean, you can see how that could unfold. It doesn't give you any difficulty in understanding that. I mean, you can fully see how that would happen.
All unsolved scientific problems, by definition, give you difficulty. The origin of life is an unsolved biological problem. The origin of other complex organs and systems in our body are unsolved biological problems as well. But what I don't see is any fundamental barrier that would prevent evolution from solving the problems the way in which, in fact, it has. Okay. Next question.
This gentleman was next.
Yeah.
This might be a bit out of your realm, but I think it's an interesting question. I think I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. I have a good friend who's a Catholic, and he always, whenever we'd have debates about this sort of subject, he'd always throw at me, well, you know, Darwinism, or the idea of the survival of the fittest, implies that the best, the strongest, the most powerful, whatever, will eventually succeed.
Not necessarily, but go ahead.
Well, and doesn't that, believing that or subscribing to that theory, doesn't that sort of give ammunition or give comfort to sort of totalitarianism or you know, people who, you know, exploit or subjugate others?
Yeah, no, I've heard that argument all the time. And the interesting thing is an argument like that is made, I would say, in either in ignorance or in non-awareness of the last 35 or 40 years of work on evolutionary theory. And the reason for that is there's an entire theory known as kin selection, which explains altruistic and self-sacrificing behavior. One of the things that Darwin wrote about is he said, you know, if behavior is something that can be acted upon by natural selection, the behavior of all animals ought to be ruthlessly selfish. They'll do everything for themselves, just as you described. But Darwin, again, he's a great observer. He also wrote, but it's not that way. There are many examples of basically, he didn't use these words, but of animals being really nice to each other and very cooperative and forming coherent family groups and things that we recognize as love. And he would say, I frankly admit, I can't explain this. Well, in the 1950s and 60s, R.D. Hamilton and Robert Trivers did explain it. And they explained it by this process called kin selection. And that is, to the extent that behaviors are genetically determined, altruistic behaviors, these nice behaviors, self-sacrificing behaviors, can actually be the winners in natural selection if that altruistic behavior is directed towards close relatives who are likely to carry copies of the same gene. And contrary to what you heard in the first question, the selfish gene idea doesn't mean that genes should be selfish in terms of the behavior they program. The selfish gene idea actually means that genes are selfish, you might say, in their wish to survive, but in so doing, they can program remarkable self-sacrificing and altruistic behavior. It's not the biggest, the strongest, and the most ruthless who win this, what Darwin called the struggle for existence. The real question is how many copies of your own gene can you put into the next generation? And you can succeed at this game by being cooperative, nice, and very sexy. And that's one of the ways in which you can succeed. And one of my favorite examples of all of this is actually a question that I've heard Richard Dawkins ask audiences. And I do this every year with my own students just to get them laughing. And I say, now I want you to think about your immediate relatives, nobody else. Your mom and dad, your grandparents, and if you know anything about them, your great-grandparents. Okay, think about them, think about their lives, if they've deceased, think when they died, and so forth. How many of your immediate relatives died before the age of 10? And people start to think and they realize, wait a minute, 0. Because if they had died before the age of 10, they wouldn't be my relative. So every single one of us is, in effect, a child of winners. And what I mean by child of winners is not big, strong, and selfish, but capable of producing and nurturing offspring into the next generation. So this ethic of ruthless selfishness, there are two answers to it. One is, that's not actually how natural selection works most of the time. Cooperation, nurturing, and altruism, in many respects, is the proper survival strategy. And then the second thing is the way that nature works is not necessarily an ethical lesson for us in terms of how we ought to conduct our lives. That's one of the reasons why I think we have the ability to do moral reasoning, is because what might work or what might benefit you or might benefit me in a selfish sense is not necessarily the ethical way to build a society. And I think that's why we have big brains and we should use them. Okay. Yep. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Miller.
Thank you.
There was something you said that has been on my mind throughout this talk too, that about the mindfulness of nature. I don't think you use that term, but I think very often evolution is, we've got this polarity of intelligent design over here and mindless evolution over here. And I would like to propose that there may be something in between, and I would call it mindful evolution.
Okay.
And it's obvious that mind, or minds have been on this planet for a very long time. They've been hunting, they've been gathering, they've been doing all the things that minds do. And this mind has clearly been shaping the world. Whenever I look at evolutionary stories, which sometimes sound like fairy tales to me, they do have intelligence embedded in them very often. And I think it's important to acknowledge that intelligence is itself a force that shapes the world and has been shaping it for a very long time. Whatever invented photosynthesis was damn brilliant. It exhibited a kind of intelligence that to us would be some kind of freakish alien genius. So I just want to say that there's something that is acting as though it were very, very intelligent.
Yeah, and I would argue that that is that intelligence derives from the parameters of nature itself, in terms of the process that makes all of this possible. And again, one of the things that I've tried to argue is the very laws of chemistry and physics and the conditions under which our universe exists are what makes an evolutionary process possible. And that evolutionary process explores one solution after another to problems like gathering energy on a planet in which you have this beautiful envelope of powerful visible sunlight. And that's what photosynthesis is an answer to. And it took that process about 1 billion or 1.5 billion years to get photosynthesis to the point where it worked. And lo and behold, when it started to work, it changed this planet profoundly, because there is a geological point about 1.5 billion years after the planet formed where all of a sudden the atmosphere changed basically from a reducing atmosphere to the oxygenic atmosphere that we have today. And that clearly was the result of photosynthesis. Didn't happen right away, but it took about 1.5 billion years of poking about. And I think that intelligence arises right out of nature. Okay?
Yeah, I'm popping up again. As a person who is over in the Dawkins Hitchens School, I'm an atheist. I see nothing beyond those fabulous mechanisms of nature that's necessary to explain the natural, to explain anything that I've seen or experienced. I also want to say how much one of the things I appreciate by you is the bridge between us and people of faith. And the answers you give and the work that you do is fabulous in that area. But it also makes me curious, asking you as a person who retains faith in God, where the idea of the miracle actually fits into your evolutionary cosmology. Is it even possible? I know one of the things that believers really don't want to give up is the idea that this divine consciousness can actually reach into their lives and make physical as well as emotional or mental changes. So I'm curious, as a person of faith, with your also naturalistic view of the universe, how the miracle, if it can occur, and if so, how that is possible.
Yeah, well, I'm asked that a lot, and I didn't try to give a talk tonight to convert anybody. I tried to explain there are ways that people of faith can understand the evolutionary process as being consistent with faith. But I'm asked that all the time. To be a theist of any sort is to believe in the miraculous in one sense or another. And I would start out by saying I think the first miracle is existence itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? To me, science is not this sphere of rationality where when I become a religious person, I step outside the sphere of rationality and then I believe in faith-based nonsense. To me, the way in which these two paradigms fit together is that scientific rationality looks like this, and spirituality or faith encloses the whole thing. In other words, I like to ask the question, why does nature make sense? Why is this a rational universe that we can actually figure out? Is it because that's just the way it is? Or is it because there actually is an intelligence behind it? And to me, that second answer is the one that makes sense to me. And I often ask my atheist friends, and believe me, I have lots of them, why do you think nature is self-explanatory? Now, not all of them do. But to claim that, say, because, pardon me? Well, to me, that self-explanatory nature is not a simple solution. It's an enormously complex one because I regard it almost as a refusal to answer the question, which is not what Occam's razor is. But I don't want to get into an argument with you. But the nature of how do you think that God can influence your life? Well, when I speak to a religious audience, almost every person in there will say that they believe in the power of prayer and they believe that God has influenced their life. And you know what? I think that too. But if I was then to say the ways or ask them for the ways in which they said that, a skeptic would say, well, you're just deluding yourself. You're convincing yourself, and in fact, there are perfectly good naturalistic explanations for them. Now, at the risk of going on too long, because I'm going to go out there and sign some books and so forth, so I'll make this very quick. I want to give you an example of a miracle that I think happened to a friend of mine. I have a very good friend at Brown Medical School named Tim Flanagan. His wife, and I can't pronounce her last name, I'm sorry, it's Slavic. Her name is Luba. She's also a professor at Brown Medical School. They have 3 children. Their oldest children are 13 and 14, then they have one young child who's about 4. And they started to talk about the fact that the older children are natural playmates, 4-year-old kid kind of alone and isolated. Luba didn't want to have another child. She is Croatian in terms of her ancestry. And when the Civil War was ended in the Balkans, all these orphanages, and she says, why don't we go over there? She still has family there, and let's adopt a Croatian kid about our daughter's age. And they sort of look like each other, fit into the family. So they do this. They go over there, and they go into an orphanage, and they see one of these horrible scenes where the orphanage lines everybody up, and then you have the rich Westerners come in and pick which kid they want. So they go down the line, and they see this little boy, and he just, there's something in his eyes. They just say, this is the kid we want. So they go to the director of the orphanage and said, we'd like number so-and-so. That's how it worked. And the guy says, you don't want him. And he goes, why? And he says, we give all our kids blood tests. That kid has hepatitis C. He's going to be sick his whole life. He might give it to your kids. You don't want that kid. So Luba and Tim went back to their hotel room. they prayed on this because they're both religious people, and they got up the next morning and they said, wait a minute, no. We are both professors of infectious disease at one of the world's great medical schools. Who are the best two people in the world to take care of a kid with hepatitis C? And there's something, we think God was calling us to do this. We're going to take this kid anyway. So 6 months later, they process the papers, they bring the kid home. Tim brings him to Rhode Island Hospital and has physical done on him, and he tells the technicians, double glove yourself because my son has hepatitis C, be real careful. So half an hour later, the technician comes jogging back into Tim's office and says, your son doesn't have hepatitis C. He says, we did all the blood work, he's clean. And Tim realizes that there's an explanation for this. And that is in Eastern Europe, they use an old-fashioned antibody-based test called an ELISA because it's cheap. ELISA gives a lot of false positives. In Western countries, including the US, we use a PCR test, which looks for the RNA in the virus. Very accurate, very few false positives. This kid was clean. Now, Tim spoke to me about this. He says, I know that my son didn't have hep C, and because I did the right thing and prayed, suddenly he was cured. But on the other hand, I feel like we were being tested. And that test was somehow prearranged. It was there. I felt we did the right thing. I felt our faith guided us, and I think we were rewarded appropriately. To me, that's my definition of what a miracle is like. Okay? I'm sorry if that took too long.
This will be our last question.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sure you've probably seen or heard of Ben Stein's rendition, his sort of documentary called Expelled.
Absolutely.
I was just curious if you could
I wrote a review of it for the Boston Globe.
Okay.
So for those of you who didn't see it, the number one, no kidding, the number one documentary in the United States in 2008 was Expelled. And it was hosted by Ben Stein. And it was a documentary basically trying it was a documentary on behalf of the intelligent design movement, trying to explain why this idea, after 10 years of trying, has gotten no traction in the scientific community. And the thesis in Expelled is that soon as any scientist speaks up in favor of intelligent design, they are fired, denied tenure, not given a grant. In short, they are expelled from the scientific community. So that's the argument. And he uses several individual cases as an example. There's another thread that runs through it as well, and that is that ultimate responsibility for the Nazi Holocaust, for the death of 6 million people in the ovens and gas chambers, rests with Charles Darwin, because he argues that the Englishman Charles Darwin promulgated these theories of racial superiority, which allowed the Nazis to go ahead and do this. I think it was a scandalous piece of filmmaking. It was loaded with inaccuracies. The cause célèbre in the movie is a guy named Richard von Sternberg, who's a scientific investigator, whom the movie says lost his position at the Smithsonian and lost his editorship of a journal as a result of publishing a pro-intelligent design paper. The reality is Sternberg never had a position at the Smithsonian, and that he resigned his editorship of the journal 3 months before the article was published. So he didn't lose the editorship as a result of publishing this. He was, and still is, an investigator at the National Institutes of Health. He had courtesy privileges at the Smithsonian that had a 2-year term. At the end of the 2 years, they took his keys and said, your courtesy privileges are up. So all of this basically, the facts were very cleverly presented. So Ben Stein asked him at one point, so you were the editor of the journal, you published this paper, and what happened? And Sternberg said, let me say this, I am no longer the editor of the journal. The implication being that the reaction was because of this, when in fact it wasn't the case. So if you'd like to look up all the details, there's another website called expelledexposed.com that goes through the movie chapter and verse and shows its inaccuracies. I also was deeply depressed. You know, I'm a big Ferris Bueller fan, and I loved Ben Stein in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and I loved With Ben Stein's Money, cable TV show. I watched it every night because I was trying to beat Ben Stein because he's a great guy and he's very funny. But I saw him, and I have a clip of it on my computer, which I could show right now, on a Christian TV show, talking about Nazis, evolution, the Holocaust, and he described this horrible death camp at a place called Hadamar, and he described all the children that were separated from their parents and then slaughtered and so forth. And here's what he said. It's almost verbatim, and I can check it to get it verbatim. Ben Stein says, in my opinion, that's where science leads you. Science. He said, science leads you to extermination. And I thought, what a terribly jaundiced opinion of the scientific enterprise. So my review was not positive. Okay. Anyway, yeah. Thank you all very much.